liftoff. Hey, ho.
Oh, we're live.
We're live. Calling with fire in Chicago.
Oh, yes, I'm in. Yeah, you're very excited to be on the show. I'm in Chicago and calling Chris Anderson in
Luxembourg.
Luxembourg, one of my favorite countries. Although many Americans don't even know that Luxembourg is a country. But we try to educate people as much as we can. Welcome to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help and assistance of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. And Chris and I are traveling the globe. I was in Philadelphia, so that's almost traveling the globe.
That's almost traveling the globe.
We still managed to be here Sundays to have a cocktail and talk about history. And I think we're going to, today we're going to go down to the sea for what I think will be a fascinating conversation. And I want to say, of course, a big thank you to all of our Patreon supporters, especially our top shelf supporters. Here, this is how we kind of keep the show going and make stuff happen. So if you're so inclined, we sure would appreciate if you would join us as a supporter on Patreon. And Chris, a reminder that you can find out about upcoming shows on our website, historyhappyhour.net. So
we have to update the reading lists. Yes.
Yeah, there you go. So listen, I think we've killed enough time to get going. What do you say? So give me a cue. Oh, hang on, I just pushed the wrong button, Chris. I don't know what I'm doing here. Give me a cue and we'll get started. The bar is open. And Chris, I want to start today's show by posing a question to our audience and asking everybody watching to get involved. Usually we don't ask your help right away at the beginning of the show, but today is going to be different. I'd like you to, maybe you can tell us about your favorite book about the sea, or one of your favorites, and in a sentence, why you think it's such a great book. Could be a history book, could be fiction. What captures for you the history, importance, the lore of the oceans? And we want to hear from you because it'll be interesting to compare your thoughts with those of our guest today, Admiral James Stavridis, who has written a book called The Sailor's Bookshelf, which is, in fact, a book about books about the sea. And I want to say that Admiral Stavridis rose to be a 4-star admiral in the U.S. Navy in a distinguished career that culminated in him being the Supreme Commander of NATO. He also has a Ph.D. in international relations and is the author of more than 10 books. I want to make it quite clear that neither Chris nor I is intimidated by this, even though we damn well ought to be. So, Admiral, welcome to History Happy Hour.
You hear me?
Yep.
We do hear you. Are you having trouble hearing us? This is the technology. It works always perfectly when you're off the air. Well, let me just try bringing you out again and bringing you in again. Everybody, hang on. This is the exciting stuff that happens here in History Happy Hour. And I'll try to just check your audio settings, which seem like they're okay. Can you hear us now?
Well.
So, if you can hear me at all, I would suggest that you try to click in again. I'm gonna knock you off.
Okay, I'm gonna drop out
and
come back in.
Everything just changed. Can you hear us now? No, he can't. Yeah, you drop out, drop back in. Hang on. Okay. So, maybe.
So there I was.
Chris, I forgot to ask who's with us today. Maybe you can tell us about some of our viewers who are here.
Nancy and Jack Sadler, William Baker, who correctly points out Aubrey Maturin and Patrick O'Brien. Good choice.
I'm sure we'll get to that.
Stephen Dean, Susan Yu, who's going to be joining the Manhattan Project tour, I think she said.
Fantastic.
Doug McCord. So Doug is done with his birthday celebrations. Happy birthday, Doug.
Yeah, it was his birthday, and yet it wasn't. Because
Doug was, well then, not birthday, Doug.
Doug was born on February 29th.
You just told me you went to his birthday. You didn't tell me that it wasn't really his birthday. Thanks,
I just told you. I think I just admitted that. I said History Happy. Honesty is a History Happy Hour, brand element. We are getting some different books here, and we'll bring some of these up. I'm looking at them in the chat. You can review them as well. And do add in your choice if you haven't done so yet, and we'll try to bring some of those up with our guest. What would yours be, Chris?
Well, I mean, it's kind of hard, but Craig Simons, as far as military history goes, I think is my favorite. We've had him on the show a couple of times, but of course I'm really gratified to see that I'm not the only person that obsessively reads Patrick O'Brien and Master and Commander. So
he's also well mentioned in this book.
Absolutely.
And Admiral, can you hear us now?
Yeah, I can hear you, and hopefully you can hear me.
We can hear you fine, and we've just whetted everyone's appetite, so they just want more. So in your career, you've written about sea power and international relations, and later in the book, we're going to touch base with you about another book you've written about crisis decision-making. This book is a really different book from those. It's really kind of a very personal book. So what made you want to write this book and put it together?
Well, first of all, I'm a crazy bibliophile. I have 5,000 books in my house. My wife calls it a gentle madness. And I've just always loved books, partly because when I was a young boy, my family moved to Athens, Greece in the late 1960s. No television in Greece. So every week, my mom would take me to the English library and would check out books. So I became a reader very early on. So passion number one, reading. Passion number two, the oceans. I remember the first time I went down to the sea in a ship. I remember the first time going to sea in a warship. All these are very vivid memories. So twin passions in my life, reading and the sea. Thus, what were the 50 books that really shaped my sense of the sea? The result is the one we'll talk about today.
That must have been a very hard list to compile. So one of the questions I had as I was reading the book, and I am also an obsessive bibliophile, and this is something that both Rick and my wife can attest to. Does it strike you that there's anything different about books about the sea than, say, just an ordinary book? Is there something special about that type of literature, do you think, that kind of sets it apart?
I think so. Perhaps two things really set it apart. One is the sea is so eternal as anything can be on this planet. And I always say when I stand on the bridge of a ship and I look out at that distant horizon, I see a place where the sea meets the sky. And I used to ask myself, what am I looking at? And at that place, I'm looking at eternity. And I think books about the sea have that sense of you're part of something much, much, much larger than yourself. And so I think books about the sea help keep our lives in perspective, our small victories and great disappointments, or the reverse. When you go to sea, you see eternity, you get things in perspective. And then secondly, the way waves crash ashore, I think books about the sea tend to pick up that conflict, that edge zone where sea and land come together. And I think all great books, be they novels or nonfiction or history or any genre, are really about the collision of two things. And I think books about the sea inherently are because of the ocean and the land.
I want to follow up on that question because your book is kind of many things. It's a guide to books about the sea. It's a window into your life because you talk about how and when you encountered many of these books and how they impacted you. And it's also maybe a call to action is too strong, but a strong suggestion that focusing on the ocean is important. And you write, so much of the voyage of the human race on this planet will ultimately depend on our knowledge and appreciation about the vast world ocean. What do you mean by that?
Well, let's start with, I suppose, coincidence, but the oceans of the world cover 70% of the planet. 70% of the planet is covered by water. 70% of the oxygen we breathe, roughly, comes from photosynthesis in the sea. And 70% of your body is composed of water. probably a coincidence. But when I look at the confluence of those three things, this vast world ocean, the British always say the sea is one. The sea is one, meaning it connects everywhere. Sure, there are choke points and there are places where massive continents intrude. But to give you a sense of the scale of the oceans, you could take all the land on Earth and it would fit inside the Pacific Ocean. It's a huge water sweep out there. And second point, the air we breathe comes from the oceans largely. Al Gore loves to say, the Amazon, the lungs of the earth. Yeah, maybe a lobe in a lung somewhere. The lungs of the earth are the oceans. That's where we get 70% of the oxygen we breathe. And then thirdly, I think that each of us is called to the sea at some point. Who has not stood on the edge of the ocean and seen what we talked about, Chris, a minute ago, the eternity of it, the difference of it. I think for all those reasons, books and literature about the sea are just so crucial and so important. And final thought here, to your point, if we don't tend that garden of the oceans, we risk our lives on this planet. And it could come from rising sea levels due to global warming. It could come from increased salinification of the oceans that upsets the algae, the plankton that create this photosynthesis. It could be the massive quantities of plastics we're dumping into it. There's a field of plastic in the Pacific Ocean that's the size of the state of Texas. I am not making that up. And finally, fishing and fisheries and protein and livelihoods. For all these reasons, the oceans are very important. And tragically, some would say the oceans are the world's largest crime scene. They're unregulated in many ways. And all the things I just talked about, there's no United Nations for the oceans. There's no NATO to guard the oceans. It's something we have to do collectively or we run grave risk.
One of the things that I'd kind of like to get your perspective on is obviously it's a pretty big topic that you've chosen to write on, and we come at it from different angles. Obviously, Rick and I doing a lot of history. We tend to focus on the history books, but you divide this book up into different types of books, and I'd like you to kind of maybe expand a bit on how you divided up this huge pie and why you approached it the way you did. It's not just all your 50 favorite history books about the oceans. It's not just it's a lot. It's broader than that.
Indeed, it is a vast subject, and the taxonomy was kind of challenging. And like all taxonomies, it gets a little artificial in places. But I divided it into 4 big groups. One I called simply the oceans. And this is where I put books that were really about understanding the physicality of the ocean. There's a biography of the species cod in there. There's a marvelous book by Simon Winchester about the Atlantic Ocean. There are some pretty technical books about how you navigate the oceans. There's another wonderful book about longitude, kind of a technical book, but a real detective story about how mankind finally figured out one of the great mysteries of navigation, which is simply how to figure out where you are on the planet, east or west. So the first one is the oceans, and it's got some technical things and some tools that mariners use. The second, and I think this is one of my favorite areas, is called the explorers. Because think for a minute about how much courage, how much grit, how much determination it would have taken 5,000 years ago to get in a canoe, effectively an outrigger, and transit across the Pacific Ocean. It seems unimaginable. And also just think how early humans perceived the oceans. You can't walk on water. You have to learn how to swim. You have to learn what's out there and learn how to harvest it. And then, gosh, going out of sight of land. Who were the first humans who did that? So that whole idea of exploration, which I think is so wrapped up with the human psyche, and here, the classic great explorer, in my view, is the British sea captain, Captain Cook, or vast branches of the Pacific. And you can argue about some of the Portuguese navigators and about Bougainville from France, and but for my money, it's Captain Cook. But there is also another marvelous book in here about an explorer and an exploration that goes terribly, terribly wrong, but has a happy ending. And that, of course, is the story of the Endurance. And Ernest Shackleton, one of the great explorations, failures, that turns into a triumph of leadership and heroism when he rescues every member of his crew after his ship is crushed in the ice in the water. So the second big zone are the explorers. And then third, and for me, a close tie, because I'm a huge consumer of fiction, which often surprises people. I think sometimes people think, oh, he's a 4-star admiral, and just sit around and read Geopolitics 101, or endlessly read history. And I do love history, and of course, we're in the history happy hour here. But sailors in fiction, I think, is just a wonderful segment. And a number of them are historical fiction, some of them quite good. Others are imaginative works of fiction, like the Bedford Incident, a Cold War novel about a near war between the United States and the Soviet Union. But here you'll find some real classic novels of the sea, including Nicholas Montserrat's The Cruel Sea, one of my personal favorites, The King Mutiny by Herman Wouk. And by the way, I would love to have included one of Wouk's other great sea novels, is The Winds of War and War of Remembrance, well known to the two of you, of course, given that you do the Ambrose tours and so on. But for my money, The King Mutiny is just so tied into being a ship captain, leading a crew, having the crew turn against you, the ocean, the weather, really fabulous. And then the last section is sailors in nonfiction, which I think is probably closest to the history happy hour crowd, but it's got a lot of history in it that stretches all the way back to the ancient Greeks. I'm Greek American, so I'm required to have a reference to Greece.
Is it a rule? Is it a okay?
No rule. That take away my Greek baptism.
We'll make a note on the official form that you have done that.
I've just accomplished that. But that section of nonfiction goes largely history and goes back to the ancient Greeks, the Battle of Salamis, goes to maybe the most important sea battle in history, yet one of the least well-known, the Battle of Lepanto in the Middle Ages, and then takes us, of course, into the apotheosis of the American Navy in the Second World War, including a book like Sea of Thunder about Lady Bell. So I apologize for the length of the answer, but I think it's the heart question of Stavridis, how did you put this book together? And I tried to kind of bucket it in those ways, and I think it kind of hangs together.
Absolutely.
Well, we've gotten a lot of comments from people about some of their favorites, and there's certainly some great overlap. The Master and Commander series comes up a few times, and I know that Chris would be unhappy. We actually talked about it when you were not with us.
Well, let me say this. In my library, I have the 20 volumes, all first editions, and the 17th is signed by Patrick O'Brien. The 17th is the Commodore, and he signed it to me as I became the Commodore of Destroyer Squadron 21. That's a treasure.
Well, when I read your book, I was definitely just a little envious when you told me, when I read about your signed Patrick O'Brien book. So I was like, yeah,
they're not making that so.
No.
We have a number of people who've also
very mysterious guy. He purported to be Irish. Turns out he wasn't. He was British. I mean, there's a whole backstory. He really was Stephen Matter come to life.
He's
strange. A lot of weird angles.
He wanted to be in the Navy, but he washed out, or wasn't there?
Absolutely. It's not even clear that he actually washed out. And I mean, completely self-taught as a sailor. I mean, it's an amazing story. And lived the last part of his life in the south of France. Wouldn't go back to the United Kingdom. There's a lot, frankly, not quite right about Patrick O'Brien.
But he wrote great books.
Now, the 20-volume set, I would argue, greatest sustained piece of fiction written, certainly in the 20th century. Now, I'd put it alongside Jane Austen.
Oh, you're warming Chris's heart.
Yeah, I just love it.
So that's come up a lot. A book that's not on your main 50 list, but because you cheated and you had 15 extras at the end, overtime. Tin Can Sailors.
Oh gosh, I'll tell you what. If I had this book to do over again, and I'm going to say this, and with all due respect to the book that edged it out, the book that edged it out is called Sea of Thunder: 4 Commanders in the Last Great Naval Campaign. It's by Evan Thomas, who's a journalist and a very fine journalist. He co-wrote The Best and Brightest. He co-wrote The Wise Men, similar book. Co-wrote The Wise Men with Walter Isaacson. I mean, Evan Thomas, is very good. And I put that book there because it brought both Halsey and Ernest Evans, the captain of the Johnston, to life. In retrospect, I would drop that one and I would put Jim Hornfisher's book on there. And also because Jim Hornfisher tragically died late last year. And, I felt to myself, hey, Jim will have other books that have come along. But boy, The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, it'll break your heart. And it'll inspire you. And oh, by the way, just released the graphic novel last week. The Tin Can Sailors. It was a graphic novel published by the Naval Institute. It's superb. It's good. It's really good. I like graphic novels too.
Chris, if Admiral Stavridis isn't too busy, maybe he can start handling our reading list because clearly he's up on it. Although it might suddenly tilt very ocean and.
As long as Patrick O'Brien is in every reading list, we'll be just fine.
I'm going to go one more here, and
I got an interesting story, Patrick O'Brien thing, and ties to writing, which is the following. As my my first novel came out, 2034, a novel of the next World War, and it's a work of fiction. So it came out really well, hit number 6 on the New York Times bestseller list. My publisher, Penguin Press, Random House, came to me and said, Stavridis, we want to give you a contract to write a novel of historical fiction about someone in the United States Navy like Patrick O'Brien. We want you to write the American Patrick O'Brien series.
Right.
And so their idea was for me to do a Revolutionary War figure, kind of in the John Paul Jones kind of mode. And I said, no. Patrick O'Brien wrote his novels about the apotheosis, the highest, the peak of the British Navy, the Napoleonic War. Right. The equivalent for the U.S. Navy is the U.S. Navy in the Pacific in the Second World War. So that's what I'm hard at work on now. That novel,
wonderful.
Yeah, working title is a line from the hymn, the Navy hymn, Eternal Father. The working title is For Those in Peril. And it follows a young naval officer from the late 30s in Key West who goes to the Naval Academy, and then he's in the heart of the Pacific War until 1944. So I'm hard at work on that, and it's a tiny little homage to Patrick O'Brien. Right. But I'm very honored they asked me to do it. They've already given me a 3-book contract to do it, so I'm hard at work on the first one.
Although if you've already gone to 1944 in book 1, where are the other 19 volumes going?
Five maps. But it's a great question. The second volume would be the jam-packed year from 44 to 45 in the post-World War II. Volume 3 is going to be the Korean War.
Oh, good.
Korean War. Volume 4, the Navy it'll center around the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cold War. Volume 5, the Navy in the War in Vietnam. It'll span one officer's career through that period.
Okay. Excellent. Is it whose turn
Chris,
is it?
I think it's your turn.
Is it? Oh well. Then this is,
If you have another question left, I mean, if
no,
you don't, we can always. Okay.
In a way, I'm going to dig for a compliment, and hopefully my wife is watching because this will help justify future purchases. But given, obviously, you have a slightly distinguished career, and could you kind of elaborate on the part that reading played in all that? You know, how important is it? Is it recreation? Is it, where does it sit?
Reading is vital. And we are talking about the sailor's bookshelf. A previous book I wrote is called The Leader's Bookshelf. And it's the same format, same idea. It's 50 books to make you a better leader. And I would argue that great leaders have four key attributes. One is intellectual curiosity, reading, listening, all of that. But I think reading is one of the fundamental components of any leader. I think another is innovation, the willingness to change your mind, to come up with a new idea. Number 3 is compassion, caring for others, caring for your sailors. And number 4 is the kind of determination and resilience, if you will, the mission accomplishment. Great leaders are those 4 things. So I would put reading, along with empathy, listening, same kind of idea, but really reading as foundational to leaders. That's why I wrote the book, The Leader's Bookshelf. And you'll find some, I think, pretty profound books of leadership in there.
So it's safe for me to say to Mrs. Anderson that really this is beneficial, and I really should be buying more books.
You absolutely should. You can never have too many books. On the back of my personal business card, I have a quote from Thomas Jefferson, which is quite simple. It says, "I cannot live without books."
See? Just right. Following orders, honey.
Chris's feed may get disconnected shortly. But following up on that, so I have books that I like to read over and over. And one example, and you've mentioned it already, and I first read it 50 years ago, Herman Wouk's magisterial World War II novels, Winds of War and War and Remembrance. Or for me, another is Shelby Foote's Civil War series, or a little book I read in college called The Dance of Legislation. Each of these books I have pulled off the shelf to read so many times that I have had to replace them. And in these 3 examples I've given you, I've had to replace them at least twice. Do you have any books that you have had to replace because you wore out your original copy?
Oh, of course. I'm going to start right where we finished a minute ago. I pulled down not Master and Commander, but the second volume, which is called Post Captain.
Yep.
I think it's a masterpiece in every dimension. The literary quality, the battle scenes, the leadership lessons. So yeah, I've read that too many times now. Number 2 has nothing to do with the sea, but it's Ernest Hemingway, and it's not The Old Man and the Sea, which I have read plenty of times. But the book I keep coming back to is The Sun Also Rises, which is set in Spain in the post-World War I era. It's just again another masterpiece of human interaction, human vulnerability. And a third one I come back to constantly is Candide by Voltaire, which is your point, Rick, a very short book. And it's a satire about a naive young man who is sold on the theory that everything in life is going to be perfect and beautiful. And as he goes through his life, it's not. And at the end of it, he discovers that real wisdom is tending your garden, understanding who you are. I think those are 3 books I keep coming back to. I guess another seagoing book I've read many times, and it's Herman Wouk. And by the way, I've read Winds of War, the first volume, several times, but read again and again the one we talked about a minute ago.
King Mutiny, which I've also read many times. So. Chris, before you ask a question,
go ahead, please.
Why don't you answer that question? Do you have books in your bookshelf that you've had to replace multiple times because you've worn out the copy?
Yes, well, both of Joe Blabkowski's books on Omaha Beach.
Omaha Beach and Utah Beach.
All Quiet on the Western Front.
Oh, that's such an extraordinary.
And Goodbye to All That.
Oh, I love that. Robert Graves. Yeah, his poetry is actually quite beautiful as well. And he also has written, Robert Graves, less well known, he's written some works of historical fiction.
Yeah.
That are actually quite good.
He did the one Private Lamb about the British soldier in America.
He did.
Yeah.
And that's quite good. I enjoy a lot of the World War I writing. I think is very powerful. Yeah. You know, we correctly think every death is a tragedy in combat. You know, in a single day, in battles on the Somme, tens of thousands.
Yeah.
Extraordinary.
Staggering. You know, one of the things that really surprised me, and it shouldn't.
Oh, guys, can I ask you guys a question?
Sure.
Where are you on, speaking of books, about your zone, where are you on Cornelius Ryan?
I'm a great admirer of Cornelius Ryan because, you know, we all live in our world. We rely very heavily on oral history and oral testimony, and Cornelius Ryan, to my way of thinking, was the man that kind of brought that form, you know, to the public. So I still refer to his books all the time.
I'm glad. I've heard some historians feel as though your point, it's too anecdoty. I love The Longest Day, and I just watched the film A Bridge Too Far, and that led me to go back and read the book, which I never read. The film's not as good as the film The Longest Day. I think it's quite good, but the Bridge Too Far, not so good as a film. But boy, terrific novel. I just read it, and you were just talking about Luxembourg. So
but you do get to see Michael Caine, you know, without a shirt on. So I mean, come on, it has some positive things. But I was going to go back to Cornelius Ryan, who. So you might find this interesting, and our audience might find this interesting. But all of Cornelius Ryan's research is now online, and you can access it. And I'm going to ask one of the people in our audience to find the website. It shouldn't be too hard to find it, but it's a Cornelius Ryan archive. So you can go in and look at the original interviews, and actually what he did on The Longest Day, which he did in conjunction with Reader's Digest, is they sent out worksheets they went to the reunions. They gave people essentially fill out this 5-page questionnaire, and then they would follow up with interviews. But he's got, you know, you can go in and read his interview with Norman Coda. You can read, and I found this amazing in the Coda collection in the Cornelius Ryan archive. There is a diary. I sent it to you, Chris, by a major named Bach, B-A-C-H-E. And he got to Omaha Beach about 10 o'clock in the morning on June 6th. And he started he actually ripped open an envelope, and then he had a little booklet he was writing it, and he's just keeping a minute by minute diary. And you know, you might think if you get too caught up in the first wave at Omaha Beach, you're going to say, well, by noon it's all over on Omaha Beach and everybody's moving inland, which they are. But in fact, there's still carnage going on in Omaha Beach, and he's documenting it. So I think that I loved the books, but I would say that the archive now lives online as this tremendous resource, and I've used it to find interesting stories and quotes and everything for the World War II tours that I do.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the great strength of Cornelius Ryan, and say what you will, you know, for the people who've come since, he's a way to get into the story, and you know, even if it's a little anecdotal, sometimes if it's compelling, people are going to read the book, and then they'll read other books. So that's got to be a good thing.
No, I love that point.
It's at Ohio State, I think. I'm finding the link here. I'll put it up. So, Chris, go ahead, ask a question, because now I'm Googling.
No, you were going to say something, sir.
I do. One thing we haven't touched on, and the word carnage reminded me of it, is actually American whaling. And the book Moby Dick, which of course is on here. And I think most scholars, if you will, would say that this is one of the 2 or 3 great American novels. And I think any maritime expert would say this whole chapter of whaling and its culture and its place in American history is pretty fascinating. And certainly any psychologist would say Moby Dick is a novel that rewards really digging in and understanding what's going on beneath the surface. But here's what I want to do, because you're historians. Also on the list of books in the Sailor's Bookshelf is someone I'm sure we all admire, and that's Nat Philbrick, who has written a whole series of marvelous works of history and pretty diverse. A lot of seagoing history in there, but a lot of American history as well. And his book, In the Heart of the Sea, the tragedy of the whale ship Essex, won, I think, the Pulitzer Prize. I could be wrong about that. But when you put those two together, Moby Dick as a novel and Nat Philbrick's book, In the Heart of the Sea, that's, I find, a really compelling kind of 1-2 punch. That I just want to
because the Heart of the Sea is about the Essex, the story that Moby Dick is based on.
Exactly. Right. And by the way, there was some cannibalism involved in the actual incident, which lends a little
a little spice, yeah.
Exactly. Oh, well, boom, Chris, that's terrible.
Okay, I'm here all night.
No, you said about Moby Dick, I thought this was really interesting. Again and again, as I read and reread Moby Dick, I see that so much of what we think of as American character is in fact related to the ocean, which I thought was really interesting. You went on, but I'll let you, rather than read everything that you said, elaborate a little bit on that.
Sure. In any treatment of Americans going to sea, there tend to be typical arcs that involve the U.S. Navy. It's John Paul Jones and Farragut and Dewey and Bull Halsey and on and on. That's the typical arc. But actually, American merchant sailing and merchant marine activities, to include this somewhat specialized activity of whaling, are really shot through the American character. And what I mean by that is there is determination. There is a sense of conquering a vast space. The other great pole of American character, of course, is manifest destiny, the conquering of the land, of this continental land. And many historians will say that's what shaped our character. And that's why, by the way, my candidate for the other great American novel, if one looks to the sea, and that's Moby Dick, the one that looks to the land and manifest destiny is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, who wrote All the Pretty Horses and a number of other books about the American West. It's the American West mythology and the way manifest destiny influenced all that. That's one pole of the American character. But my thesis is that the other pole of American character is facing the sea. It's that overcoming the challenges of the maritime world. We're an island nation in many ways. These two vast oceans on either side of us that sustain us, that protect us, that we have exploited, that are woven into many, many aspects of our character. So yes, I think Moby Dick is in many ways the great, or one of the 2 or 3 great American novels. The other one, by the way, may be The Godfather by Mario Puzo, but that's a different story.
That's a different show.
So another question I had is, you've mentioned several important historical figures in this list: Nelson, Cook. Could you talk a little bit about kind of why some of these sort of giants of history are still relevant? Why should we keep reading biographies of Cook, of Nelson, hasn't enough time passed that maybe we should let them go, or they still have something to say to us?
Oh, I think without question, they have immense things to say to us about the things we just spoke about just moments ago. In Lord Nelson, you find this very determined figure who is also full of the flaw of vanity. He desires glory, but he genuinely, deeply, truly, madly loves his country. His morals ashore are not perfect. He ends up in a
You're colorful.
horrid, passionate affair with Lady Emma Hamilton, breaking her away from her husband, an elderly volcanologist. I love that word. A scientist who studies volcanoes. Susan Sontag wrote a book about that relationship called The Volcano Lover. It's a little play on words. But Lord Nelson, I think, speaks to us in that with our greatness, sometimes all of our greatness, all our accomplishments, all our successes, yet we have deep and abiding flaws. And I think there's power in understanding that, whether you're reading someone who's contemporary and you see that occurring, a contemporary figure, a great stature and character, but who is brought down by some aspect of his or her character. Nelson walked those steps 200 years ago. And by the way, you can go back to the Battle of Salamis and look at the Greek admiral commanding that fleet, who ends up, after the battle and after heroically winning that battle, becomes shot with hubris and seeks to dominate Athenian politics and ends his days in the court of the Persian king. All of these stories, I think, speak to us as humans and are vital and important. And then lastly, from a military perspective, boy, do we have things to learn from, let's say, on topic with Lord Nelson. Here's someone who simplified battle plans, just goes straight at them, but was smart enough to know he had to build teams in the process of doing that. It was an extraordinary team builder. You mentioned a moment ago, band of brothers. Newsflash, Stephen Ambrose didn't come up with that. That actually was Nelson's idea, but it came to us from Shakespeare. From Henry V. So should we be studying the Battle of Agincourt and Henry V, the original band of brothers? I would say so. And you can drop a plumb line to the young men and women I commanded in the Forever Wars when I was the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. They were a band of brothers and sisters by that time. Yeah, I think all of that is incredibly important to us and ought to be read and studied.
For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother.
Oh, you're just showing off now.
This day will gentle his condition. I can't
frustrated
help it.
Actor.
I can't help it. I can't help it.
I love quoting Shakespeare. And we'd all be required to quote Shakespeare once a day.
I have. That is a rule for me as well. Unfortunately, I only have about less than half a dozen good quotes to do that are longer.
He just repeats them over and over.
Than to be or not to be. So yeah, I tend to rotate through them from time to time. But usually, if you stop at one, then you can convince people that you're, and then shut up. You can convince people you're smarter than you are. Shutting up is an art, which I'm still trying to master. So we could talk about books all day, and yet we said we would also talk about another book that you have published. And so first I'm going to turn away, before we turn away from it, I'm just going to put the cover up and say, great to talk about the Sailor's Bookshelf. And I found it really interesting. You can even read why this guy who wanted to be a Marine ends up becoming an admiral in the Navy. It's a little bit confusing there, but you can discover how that took place and all sorts of other interesting things in that book. But since we originally booked this interview, which was some time ago, and we had some hiccups and stuff, you've published another book, and frankly, it's starting to get, there's so many that it's starting to get, it is a little bit, you're making the rest of us look bad, so you might want to just slow it down a little bit. It's a little bit of rate busting there. But you've published another book called To Risk It All, 9 Conflicts and the Crucible of Decision. And this obviously ties in closely with your command experience, your PhD in international relations, etc. Give us a brief sense of what this book is about, and maybe give us an example of one of those 9 conflicts and the moment that is the crucible.
Well, first of all, I think this is a perfect book for the history happy hour. It's the use of history. It's practical history. And what I mean by that is, kind of to Chris's comment and question a moment ago, why should we still study people from the past and learn their stories? And the answer is because in all of our lives, no matter what you do, whether you are a combat infantry, marine, or you're a police officer, or you're a school teacher, or you're a lifeguard, or you're going to church on a Sunday morning, you may find yourself at a moment where you have to, as the title of the book says, risk it all. And certainly we think of combat, we think of what our brave police and firefighters do every day. But how about you're in church and through the back door comes a mass shooting? And the last thing you see is him chaining the doors shut. And you're in that church, maybe with your mom, maybe with your wife, maybe with your kids. What do you do at that moment? Do you risk it all and charge? Or do you curl up in a fetal ball? Or do you run and hope there's a back door? And there's no right answer to that question, by the way. This is not a book judging people. This is a book saying that moment can come for you, and you ought to be prepared. You can be standing on the beach. There is no lifeguard because we can't hire lifeguards because we don't have enough of them. And someone is clearly in great, great trouble 50 yards offshore. You know how to swim. You're a pretty good swimmer. You're going to go and try and bring them in? Or are you going to fumble your 9/11? Or are you just going to stand there and watch? Those moments come more often than I suspect most people believe. And so the idea of the book, To Risk It All, is to look at 9 case studies. And I used Navy sailors going back to the beginning of the U.S. Navy. It starts with John Paul Jones, but I chose 9 sailors who were forced in a moment to risk it all. And by the way, it would have been really easy to write a book called To Risk It All, 9 Great Decisions. This is not that book. Of the 9 cases in the book, 3 come out very badly, very badly. And 3 come out really well, and 3 are kind of in between. And so I'll pick one case study because I happen to like it a lot. It's the story of Cook Third Class Dory Miller. This guy comes out of Texas in the 30s. He's African American, not a lot of opportunity in Texas. He joins the Navy because the Navy is racially segregated. The only thing he's allowed to do is to become a cook, basically a valet who takes care of the officers' wardroom, shining their shoes, cooking their meals. He's on the battleship West Virginia on the 7th of December, 1941. The ship is sinking. It's on fire. Bullets are flying through the air. Dory Miller chooses to risk it all, to charge to the bridge of the ship, try to help his captain who's mortally wounded. Then Dory Miller goes down to a gun deck, jumps in an anti-aircraft gun that he has no idea how to operate. The shipmates are shouting at him with advice and ideas. He gets the thing up and starts firing with it and shoots down 1 or possibly 2 Japanese Zeros. Later he was asked, how'd you know how to do that? And he said, it's just like shooting ducks. You point the barrel of the gun and you think the duck is going to do it. It's an amazing story. He then survives that day miraculously. He's awarded the Navy Cross, first African American to receive. That's the highest decoration, combat decoration of the U.S. Navy. And then tragically, about 18 months later, he's on another ship, the Williamstown Bay, a light aircraft carrier that sunk, and he's lost at sea. Here's the punchline to the story. A year and a half ago, the U.S. Navy, and I'm proud to say this, chose the name of our next big, beautiful, nuclear-powered, 100,000-ton aircraft carrier, the USS Doris Miller. Pretty good story in that moment of recognition for Dory Miller. And the point of the story is sometimes you decide to reach inside yourself, find real courage, and you risk it all. And for Dory Miller, it came out well that day. Life reached out and took it 18 months later in the same war. But I think there's lessons in that story for all of us about how we would react, or we hope we would react to moments of real fear and risk.
So in researching the book, and obviously this is just a teaser, but is it simply 9 stories, or did you discover things as you were doing the research of the book that maybe you hadn't expected to find or surprised you about these moments of decision?
Yes and yes. When I started to write the book, I thought, okay, I want the through line of the book to be the U.S. Navy. So it starts with John Paul Jones, Revolutionary Navy, and his epic battle as captain of the Bonhomme Chart, 1779. Um, it is a story of determination of someone who just is not going to quit, despite the fact that everything is going wrong around. And the through line goes to Captain Brett Crozier, the captain of the Roosevelt, the ship that was brought down by COVID. And Captain Crozier's career was brought down because he made a decision to risk it all, in this case, to risk his career by launching an email. He kept it in the chain of command, but it was unclassified and leaked. It embarrassed the Navy. He did it because he wanted to protect his crew. So, Chris, when I started writing the book, I kind of had this idea of finding different cases along the spectrum. And initially, I'll be honest, I thought, okay, I'm going to write a book where there'll be 9 or maybe 10 cases where it all turns out pretty well, where all of them are admirable decisions and the decisions work out. And the more I was writing, the more I realized, boy, that's not how life works. So often the decision you make has real cost, real consequence. And so then I began looking at decisions individuals in the Navy made that didn't turn out real well. Classic one, of course, is Lloyd Booker, the Lieutenant Commander of NATO. The title of that chapter, by the way, is No Way Out, meaning there are going to be times when there is no right answer.
Yeah.
And so what I learned along the way is I wanted to, within the arc of the Navy, I wanted to have both good decisions and decisions that didn't come out so well. A little thought in the back of my mind, by the way, because people ask, why 9? It's a funny number. Why not 10? Nice round number. And what was in the back of my mind, believe it or not, was Cat O'19s. That's colors get flogged with.
Yeah.
And so I thought, decisions cause pain. And so it's a nautical thing, and I explained that in the book.
That's great.
So we are, of course, a history show, but we have touched on the current war in Ukraine several times, partly because it has such strong parallels, historic parallels with World War II, in part simply because it's top of mind. It's such a dangerous and frightening conflict. As you've studied conflict decision making, I'm wondering, this is kind of it's a sort of a two-part question. You can approach in any way you want. What lessons you've drawn that might be useful to the players in this conflict, Zelensky, Putin, or that might be useful to us in trying to understand and analyze what those guys and other leaders are doing?
If I were to put Putin and Zelensky in this book, into Risk It All, here's how I'd set it up. On the one side of that line, you have arrogance. You have misinformation. You have terrible leadership in that you have a leader who's completely isolated himself. Think of that gondola-like table that Putin now sits at with his acolytes at the far end of the table. You have a leader doing everything wrong, but who is risking it all. He's risking the reputation of his nation. He's risking its armed forces. The Russian army, the Russian phalanx is going to break. It's going to break on the stone of Ukraine. It already has. And that doesn't mean the Russians are going to get pushed out by the Ukrainians, but their capability to conduct real mischief in Europe is going to be broken by what's happening at the hands of the Ukrainians. So Putin is a case study in what happens when you risk it all with bad information, bad intelligence, bad leadership, a cracked set of assumptions. That's Putin. On the other side of the line, of course, you get Volodymyr Zelensky, who I think we all deeply underestimated. I love Zelensky because, for starters, I'm 5 feet 5 inches tall. I'm hardly that towering admiral out of central casting. And so Zelensky is exactly my height. I see everything eye to eye with Vladimir Zelensky. But leaving that aside, gosh, I'll give him the ultimate compliment. If he were captain of a ship, I'd want to be in his crew. Someone asked me the other day what I wanted in my crew. I was like, are you kidding? I want to be in his crew. And I'll tell you why. Because he is risking it all, and he's doing everything right. He is a master communicator. He has deep wells of physical courage. He's going to the front line again and again. He is a living symbol to his people. I don't know what happened to his suits. He wears honey gear everywhere. And that's the right move. When he was asked, at the start of this thing, when U.S. intelligence said the Russians are going to sweep the table, they're going to come rolling through Kyiv in the next 72 hours, we said to Zelensky, our government, let us give you a ride. Let us give you a ride out of Kyiv. And we'll put you in Lviv, and you can fight the war from there, or even a government in exile in Warsaw. And Zelensky said, quote, I don't need a ride. I need more ammunition. They're going to end up carving that in the walls of the Parliament. You watch that show. We ought to carve it on the walls of the Pentagon. It's a pretty good case study in someone who is risking it all. Do you think? I mean, Zelensky looks over his shoulder from those front lines, and what does he see? He sees his wife. He sees his 2 children. He sees his parents. He sees the elders of his society. He sees his civilization. He sees his language. They're all at risk. So Zelensky, unlike Putin, has done everything right and also deserves our support for that. And I think that pair of case studies, I would have broken the frame of doing the Navy if I had those 2 case studies, because I think it would have been a terrific way to conclude this book. As you know, books are in the can almost a year before they appear. This one appeared on the But I think that's the frame. And what should we take away from it in the United States? I would argue we ought to take away how powerful courage can be, how resilience matters, and above all, where are we broken here in this country? We're broken in our divisions, in our arguments, in our disagreements about things, frankly, that are less important than whether your country's being invaded and your children and your wives are being raped and your cities are being destroyed. You watch those Ukrainians come together as they have and look at what they're accomplishing. And yet here in the United States, we're so politically divided, we can accomplish so much less than we should be able to. By the way, I'll close on a point here, which is I'm a centrist. I'm a registered independent, always have been, neither Republican nor a Democrat. I was vetted for vice president by Hillary Clinton, one of 6 people actually vetted by the campaign, and I was offered a cabinet post by the Trump administration. I think of that, by the way, as 2 bullets whizzing by my head.
It's a good thing you're short.
That's what saved me. So when I say we need to come together, I'm not part of Fox Nation, nor am I someone who's locked on the left. I call them like I see them. I'm a centrist. We need to come together. And watching the Ukrainians, when they have to risk it all, their country, their way of life, their language, boy, there's a lot to admire there, and there's a lot we can.
Well, well said. And I think on that note, Admiral James Stavridis, we have to bid you adieu, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, sir.
And of course, these great books we've been talking about, The Sailor's Bookshelf, 50 Books to Know the Sea. I have to take off my glasses and lean in to read the subtitle. And To Risk It All, 9 Conflicts In the Crucible of Decision. I read the first one and liked it. The second one I want to read. So I read the table of contents, which kind of makes me an expert on it. So check them out. Thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
My pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Look forward to coming back again.
I hope so. Excellent. Thank you.
Stay well. And Chris, next week is an encore episode, and we haven't picked it yet. So I was actually going.
Any suggestions?
I was going to invite our audience, who came up with so many great books that I hope you also checked out in the chat section. Ask them to see if you guys have any shows you want us to repeat. It's July 4th weekend. If a good choice comes through, maybe we can do that. Otherwise,
we could do in honor of July 4th weekend. I think we do that interview about George III.
Well, that would be ironic, and yes, we could. Yes, we could, if that's what people want to
get my plug in there.
Be happy to do that with Andrew Roberts and his fantastic book about George III. But let us know if you have a choice, and then we'll be back in live in 2 weeks with, fear not, Nazis. So,
yay! Boy, I've missed them.
We're going to get back to some Nazis, and the book is called, in 2 weeks, Nazis on the Potomac. But don't worry, they're prisoners. we just want to.
But are they?
They're interesting story. Anyway, terrific show today, Chris. Thanks so much. Great to see you.
Thank you.
And thank you everybody for joining us. Really appreciate it. Like us, follow us, give us money on Patreon, do all those great things, or not. We're kind of whatever you do. We appreciate your being here and being part of the show.
Thanks so much, everyone. Be safe.